How's it going, everyone, and welcome back to Spearman Studios, where today we're going to be talking about not one, but two movies. And no, I'm not talking about Breakthrough or even The Curse of La Llorona, because both of those I have almost no interest in viewing. But instead, we're going to be catching up on films from last week, which were Hellboy and Missing Link. So let's start off with one that I have the least thoughts on, and then we'll move on to the one I have most thoughts on. So let's start off with Missing Link. Missing Link is the fifth movie produced by Leica Studios. Leica has become kind of an influential figure in terms of production companies here in Oregon. It's definitely one of the most popular independents in Oregon. And so by actually going out to view this film, I support Oregon filmmakers, as I naturally do. And in terms of the production company's history, there have been some pretty good movies that they have put out. Personally, I really like Coraline. Paranorman's a really good Halloween film. And then Kubo and the Two Strings is a very good film. Not great in terms of narrative, but in terms of technical aspects, like the technology on display in terms of stop motion is fantastic. And then you get Box Trolls, which isn't necessarily my favorite, but it's just kind of like a children's fluff. I'll just say it, it's children's fluff. So now we move on to Missing Link, which I believe to be the most Pacific Northwest film I've ever seen, because the subject matter already alone is very much like, oh yeah, we're going to make a movie about Sasquatch. And if you know nothing about Sasquatch, trust me, if you go down to Oregon or Washington, it's everywhere. It's like Sasquatch is our state's like biggest urban legend. It's the biggest thing ever. And for Leica Studios to produce a movie about, mythical creatures like the Loch Ness Monster and the Yeti and the Sasquatch, it's pretty much down everyone's alley. If you're in Oregon and you see this film, everyone's going to watch it, right? So what is this film about? What is Missing Link about? Well, it stars Hugh Jackman as this sort of he wants to be an explorer. This is a character who wants to be a very famous explorer. He wants to be part of the society who doesn't accept him, and he goes off and he tries to prove the existence of Sasquatch, all to the detestment of various oligarchs who go like, oh, most unorthodox. Oh, this is so unorthodox. It's a big meme, really. But then we get into, the main theme of the story, which is kind of, don't let others force you to become something you don't want to be. It's kind of, you can kind of predict the themes of this film pretty much from day one. Like, as soon as you see the scene where Hugh Jackman's character goes in and confronts the society about, getting a letter from Sasquatch, it's pretty much over. You already know what the themes of the film are going to really be. And they don't really address it all that often in the movie, although it's not necessarily underhanded either. Especially when Zoe Saldana's character comes into play, and she's pretty much, hey, Hugh Jackman, you're supposed to be, over here, supposed to be doing that. I'll say that Missing Link is kind of just, another fluffy film. It's very light in terms of viewing. It's only about an hour and a half long, which isn't so bad. And it's not and I'm not saying it's bad, and I'm not saying it's mediocre. I'm saying it's still good. The biggest plus that I have about this, the two biggest plus I have, is that one is the voice acting. The voice acting from Hugh Jackman, Zoe Saldana, and Zach Galifianakis, they all do a pretty good job with their respective character roles, especially with Galifianakis playing, this bumbling, Sasquatch character who doesn't really know anything about the human world, but he tries to make up for it. And there's actually some pretty funny scenes in here. There's a lot of really interesting characters they put on display. And that's about it. And then, of course, the animation. The animation here is still really cool to see. How they've been able to update stop motion ever since they first started out with Coraline so many years ago is still an astounding thing to watch. Everything they do with animation in this movie is pretty interesting and pretty fun to watch. And it makes me really glad that there are still independent companies out there that are willing to put out animated films that isn't just from Disney or Warner Animation Group or even DreamWorks or Sony Animation. Like, I'm just so glad that there's independent animation studios, and that's also a big plus that I have for this film, regardless if the film is of quality. My main issue really with the film is just the story. The story just kind of seems very fluffy. There's not much in terms of substance there. But in terms of a good movie to show to younger kids and to nice medium-sized kids, I guess, it's still fun to watch. I mean, it is a Leica Studios film, but again, the biggest flaw with any of these Leica Studios films is that none of them have been too heavily marketable to the point where, you know, they're big box office draws. They're kind of a niche thing, which isn't a bad thing, honestly. I don't think it's too big of a negative. It's just one of those niche studios that not a lot of people really go aspire to be like, oh, this is such a great studio. You know, most people with their, you know, big boy dollars, they go out and go watch Disney films, they go out and watch Fox films, they go out and watch those films. And Leica Studios and Annapurna, you know, they do their best to try to promote a film that is of an independent quality, and that is something of worth to say. It's a positive and somewhat of a negative, but it's not too much of a negative. I hope that doesn't make it confusing. But for me personally, I found it okay. It's a fine movie. It's not terrible. It's still kind of good in a lot of aspects. It's just the story and characters. It's just kind of, you know, it's okay. I just find it majorly okay. So I'm going to give Missing Link a B-. Now moving on to the film that I have the most thoughts on, and that's Hellboy. Hellboy 2019 is kind of an odd film for many people. Is that because, you know, Guillermo del Toro, ever since 2004, he did, you know, the first Hellboy movie, and then he did Golden Army in 2007. And for a long time since then, he's been wanting to do a Hellboy 3, and it went through development hell. Like, no one could agree on anything. Up until the point where Guillermo just said, you know what, screw it. You know, since you're not going to give me my film, you're not going to get a third movie, so you might as well reboot it. And they did. They rebooted it for this year. And it stars David Harbour as Hellboy, and this is a complete reboot, so it has almost no connection to the Ron Perlman films, which wipes the slate clean for Neil Marshall, who did the Descent, a pretty good claustrophobic horror film, I will say. And Hellboy is about David Harbour's Hellboy, and there's this Blood Queen, who is about to, you know, reemerge from the depths of hell and is wanting to destroy the entire world with Hellboy's help. And I will say that for the most part, this movie was just kind of fine, but there's definitely qualities of it that really don't work. Like, script-wise, it doesn't work. So let's talk about the one thing that I kind of liked. There's certain sequences in this film that are interesting. Like, there's this whole part where Hellboy grabs an object. I'm not going to say what it is. He grabs an object and gets a vision of the amount of power he will have. And this whole sequence, like, it's only about a minute and a half long. But for the most part, it's just visually engaging. Like, it looks really cool. It looks like it's from the comics. There's certain images in this movie that are straight from the comics, which I do appreciate. But one of the biggest drawbacks of this film in terms of the narrative is that Hellboy himself is not that interesting of a character. He's not a really good character at all. In fact, he's pretty much like, oh yeah, I'm a badass character that has daddy issues. That's about it. That's about all we really get from Hellboy. And just for comparison's sake, the original Hellboy, while not perfect, really captured the spirit of what Hellboy was in the comics. Because in terms of, you know, Hellboy himself, he's a character that's complex in the way that he grew up with humans, and he has this, you know, underlying, internal behavior that could bring about the end of the world. And it's this sort of humanistic aspect that really made that character come to life, both in the comic and in the movie, the original movie. And also in the original movie, there's certain times of the movie where he's allowed downtime, that he's allowed to just kind of hang out with some of his, compatriots, like Abe Sapien. Abe Sapien was a character that Hellboy could relate to because both him and Abe are kind of outcasts. They both are. All of society doesn't like them because they're monsters and they hunt other monsters, and that's something that they could both kind of, agree on. And even like with Ron Perlman's version, he liked cats. I know it's kind of an odd thing to point out, but he really liked cats, and that allowed him to be a little bit more like, oh yeah, he's a little bit human. He's like that. And he's able to play off of other characters of his skill set. And in this movie, I just don't feel like he had enough there. I mean, you do get this one guy who could transform into a jaguar, but his sort of behavior towards Hellboy isn't necessarily that of, like being, compatriots. It's more of being antagonistic towards one another. And then you have this other character that comes in who's this psychic. And I guess they have a connection because she was involved in a case he did like years ago. Not enough of a connection there, like not as closely as like Selma Blair's character in the original Hellboy, where she can shoot fire out of her hands, and there is that previous connection that they had, but it's much more stronger in terms of narrative writing. One of the biggest things to talk about with this film is the fact that behind the scenes, there was a lot of turmoil behind the scenes. It was like something like the director had like problems with David Harbour because David Harbour was being antagonistic towards the director and the people on set because they weren't doing the things that he wanted to do. And it's a lot of nonsense, really. And to be fairly straightforward with all you guys, stuff like this, stuff like arguments behind the scenes can really ruin a piece of work. You just look at things like Josh Trank's Fan Four Stick, and that, like, stuff behind the scenes of that, it definitely suffers because of stuff like this. And I think the movie overall does that, because narratively, the reason why narratively it doesn't work is that for about a good 45% of the movie, none of the events really tie into anything. Like, there's this whole thing with the Osiris Club and these giants, and almost none of that ties directly into the current conflict that is the Blood Queen. None of that. Like, it's just kind of this weird diversion. And again, not to really, bash this movie too much, but in the original, and I hate to say it, but in the original movie, there is a way they tie in this first mission, right? They have a first mission to take down this creature that can reanimate itself. And that reanimated creature actually ties into the main conflict of the story with Rasputin. That's how you tie in the characters. But there's so many little things in this movie, so many little diversions that either A, don't really add up to anything, or B, are just there because, oh, I thought it looked cool, And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just kind of delineates from your focus on the movie. If those sections had been taken away, I don't think you would have missed much of anything, other than maybe some cool fights, I guess. But narratively speaking, there's not much there. And then you get to Baba Yaga, which is it's a really cool creature design. There's like a really nice fight between her and Hellboy in her house. But a lot of the stuff that she says, like the whole, thing that she says in that place, it comes to fruition, but then it's quickly taken away, right? It's like she says, oh, you're gonna see one of your loved ones die. And I guess that means, his dad's gonna die because that's Hellboy's origin. But once it gets to one of the characters, I'm like, oh, well, that's a different take on it. There's just not a lot of things of consequence. The psychic character, for example, During one of during the midpoint of the movie, she gets stabbed in the neck with this poisonous twig thing, and they go take her to Merlin, and Merlin's able to rip it out of her almost instantly. There's no consequence there because it's immediately taken care of. It just doesn't work. As far as David Harbour's performance goes, again, there's not much we can really attach to the character humanistically, and comes off as just kind of like an unsympathetic person rather than being a cocky, smarmy asshole character, but with some relatability, right? He's not like a Dr. House. He's not like he's not like a Iron Man, right? He's not like any of those characters. And that's one of the biggest problems, is that there's no relatability with Hellboy. In the comics, they especially made sure to do that, but with David Harbour's performance, it just makes it a little bit harder. Some other minor notes is the CGI. The CGI looks like complete garbage at times, and it seems like, again, it looks like in certain parts with the CG, it looks like they were really balancing a pretty sizable budget. But then in other shots with some of the CG, it just looks like garbage you see from a Sony Pictures movie. It just looks bad. For example, there's this wrestler at the beginning of the movie that turns into this big giant vampire, and the CG looks like crap. It looks like garbage. And I'm like, you had $100+ million and you couldn't make that convincing? You could have done something like the American Werewolf in London. Just had really cool close-up shots of practical effects. Just do practical stuff, and it would have looked cooler. It honestly would have, but I guess not. This again, Hellboy just kind of feels like a claustrophobic mess. There's a little bit of stuff that I kind of like, but I think this year, especially, I think Hellboy is this year's Venom, where it's kind of, it's bad, but there's some cool elements at the same time, and you're kind of trying to enjoy it, and in the back of your head it's just not that good. So, yeah, I'm going to give Hellboy a D+. It's not that great, guys, and I'm not going to, again, if you think that, Hellboy was great, that's fine, right? But I'm not a big fan of the new Hellboy, right? Comparatively speaking, Guillermo del Toro's version is a little bit superior. Even with some dated CGI that it has, the character work and the story are what makes that movie a lot better. Again, the original Hellboy is not like, a masterpiece or anything, but what I'm saying is, in comparison to this new one, I don't think it's that great. So, thank you guys so much for watching my double feature review, and I'll see you guys next time, hopefully, with a review on Avengers Endgame. And I promise, no spoilers, otherwise I will just disappear. Okay, that was a weird face to end on, but nevertheless, make sure to like, subscribe, comment what your favorite parts of these movies were, if you have any, but that's about it for today. So, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.